Those can't be real." The words sliced through the stale courtroom air like a blade. Judge Brennan leaned forward over his polished bench, eyes narrowing on the old man standing before him. James Harrison, 82 years old, stood motionless in his faded denim jacket. 3 rows of ribbons and a single star-shaped medal on a pale blue ribbon decorated his chest. The judge's lip curled into something between amusement and contempt. "What? You picked those up at a surplus store? Little costume jewelry for the VFW crowd?" The small gallery shifted uncomfortably. A few nervous laughs rippled from the back row. James said nothing. His gray eyes remained fixed on the American flag hanging behind the bench. His weathered hands, spotted with age, rested calmly at his sides. He didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself. He simply stood there, absorbing the mockery with an unnerving stillness that came from somewhere deep and unshakable. "I asked you a question," Judge Brennan pressed, his voice rising with irritation. "Where did you get those medals, old man?" The silence that followed was suffocating. "Before we continue, if you believe our veterans deserve respect no matter where they stand, type honor below. And tell me where you're watching from. This story of James Harrison proves that true heroes don't need to announce themselves." I read every comment. The courtroom was standard small-town America. Wood-paneled walls that had absorbed decades of testimony, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of floor polish and burnt coffee from the break room. Judge Richard Brennan presided from his elevated bench like a king on a throne, his tailored suit probably worth more than the motorcycle James had ridden here. This was supposed to be simple. A traffic violation. Running a stop sign. 20 miles over the limit on County Road 47. James hadn't contested it. He knew he'd been speeding. He came prepared to pay the fine and leave, but the judge had noticed the jacket. More specifically, he'd noticed what was pinned to it. "Your Honor," a young woman stood at the defense table. Sarah Chen, James's court-appointed public defender, fresh out of law school with idealism still burning in her eyes. "My client's service record has no bearing on this traffic case. He's here to address the citation, not to—" "I'll decide what has bearing in my courtroom, counselor." Brennan didn't even look at her. His focus remained locked on James, on those medals. "I'm simply curious about the collection. It's quite impressive for a man who can't remember basic traffic laws." The mockery was casual, almost playful, but beneath it ran a current of something darker, resentment perhaps, or the particular brand of cruelty that comes from unchecked authority. Brennan had been on the bench for 15 years. In that time, he'd developed a reputation. Tough on crime, they called it. His supporters loved his no-nonsense approach. His critics called him a bully in robes. "Let me guess," Brennan continued, leaning back in his leather chair. "You were what? A supply clerk? Maybe a cook?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Nothing wrong with that, of course. Honorable work. But parading around with a chest full of decorations like some kind of war hero? That's stolen valor, sir. And in my courtroom, it's offensive." A murmur went through the small crowd. About 20 people sat in the gallery. Most were waiting for their own cases to be called. Minor violations, parking tickets, small claims disputes. They watched with a mixture of fascination and discomfort as the judge dismantled an old man piece by piece. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that the words had landed. His posture remained military straight, shoulders squared, chin level. Even in civilian clothes, even at 82, his bearing spoke of discipline ingrained so deep it had become bone. "The medals were given to me," James said quietly. His voice was rough with age but steady, controlled, each word measured. "Given to you." Brennan repeated the words slowly, savoring them. "By whom? The costume department?" A few more uncomfortable laughs from the gallery. "Let's be clear, Mr. Harrison. I am tired of men of a certain generation thinking a uniform they wore half a century ago gives them a free pass in life. You violated traffic laws. You're standing in my courtroom. And frankly, that display," he gestured dismissively at the medals, is a distraction and a disrespect to actual veterans. Sarah felt her stomach turn. She looked at her client, this quiet old man who had barely spoken 10 words to her in their brief consultation. His file was thin, a few speeding tickets over the years, nothing else. On the intake form, under military service, he'd simply written, yes. No branch, no rank, no details. The humility of it now seemed almost heartbreaking. Take off the jacket. The words dropped like stones into still water. The courtroom went silent. Even the court reporter's fingers froze over her keys. Judge Brennan pointed directly at James. That display is inappropriate for my courtroom. Remove it. Now. Your Honor, you can't possibly... Sarah started to protest, her voice cracking with disbelief. I absolutely can, Counselor. Brennan's voice hardened into steel. This is my courtroom. The defendant will show proper respect. That jacket is a distraction. He will remove it, or I will hold him in contempt. The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Tom Vasquez, took a reluctant step forward. Tom had been bailiff for 8 years. He'd seen Judge Brennan humiliate dozens of people, but this felt different. Wrong. His eyes met James's, and for a moment, something passed between them. An apology, perhaps. An acknowledgement. James Harrison did not move. He stood perfectly still, his gaze drifting from the judge to the medals on his own chest. His eyes lingered on the one hanging from the pale blue ribbon. For just a fraction of a second, his expression shifted. Not anger. Not fear. Something else. Memory, maybe. Or grief. In the back row, a man in his 60s leaned forward. Mike Patterson, a local contractor waiting for a permit dispute hearing. He squinted at the old man's jacket, at the specific arrangement of ribbons. Mike had served. Army. 2 tours in the Gulf. He recognized some of those ribbons. The Bronze Star, the Silver Star, and that one on the blue ribbon. His breath caught. No way. That couldn't be real. Could it? Fine, Judge Brennan said when James remained motionless. His face flushed red. Bailiff, add a charge of contempt of court. $500 fine. Maybe that will get his attention. Sarah's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the defense table. This was spiraling out of control. She needed to do something, say something, but what? The judge had all the power here. She was just a public defender 2 years out of law school, already drowning in a caseload of petty crimes and plea bargains. Especially that one, Brennan continued, pointing specifically at the star-shaped medal. The absolute gall to wear a replica Medal of Honor. Do you have any idea what that represents, old man? The blood and sacrifice it stands for? You wearing that is a slap in the face to every person who ever served this country with actual honor. As the judge spoke, something strange happened to James Harrison. The courtroom seemed to fade. The judge's voice became distant, replaced by a different sound. The rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors, the sharp crack of gunfire, the smell of cordite and blood and jungle rot. He was no longer standing on worn linoleum, but was back in the sucking mud of a rice paddy outside Hugh City. February 1968. The sky was impossibly blue through the smoke. He could feel the weight of Private Miller on his back, the kid from Ohio whose leg had been torn apart by machine gun fire. The hot, wet soak of blood through his fatigues. The deafening chatter of enemy guns, stitching a line in the mud inches from his head. The memory lasted only seconds. When it passed, James was back in the courtroom, his breathing slightly deeper, more measured. But his composure remained unbroken. He simply looked at the judge with those clear gray eyes and said nothing. In the gallery, Mike Patterson pulled out his phone. His hands moved quickly, searching. He typed in what he'd seen on James's collar. A small pin, easy to miss. A crest with an arrowhead and a dagger. He found it immediately. 1st Special Forces Group. The Green Berets. Mike's pulse quickened. This changed everything. Tom Vasquez, the bailiff, stood frozen. He'd been ordered to remove the old man, but something in his gut told him to wait. Just wait. This wasn't right. The judge was making a mistake. A terrible one. Sarah glanced at her client, at his weathered face and military posture. An idea sparked. Desperate. A long shot. While Judge Brennan was busy adding his self-righteous commentary to the official record, Sarah leaned close to James. "Mr. Harrison," she whispered urgently, "is there anyone I can call? From your old unit? Anyone who can verify?" James turned his head slightly. His voice was soft. "It was a long time ago, miss. Most of them are gone now." "There has to be someone," Sarah insisted. She noticed the pin on his collar, the small crest. "Please, let me try." The judge waved dismissively. "Take 5 minutes, counselor. Get whatever file you need from your office. Your client isn't going anywhere." Sarah practically ran from the courtroom. Sarah's heels clicked frantically on the polished courthouse floor. She didn't have a file to get. She had a phone and a desperate plan. She ducked into an empty alcove, her hands trembling as she pulled up her browser and typed in a description of the pin she'd seen. U.S. Army crest, arrowhead and dagger. The results came immediately. 1st Special Forces Group, Fort Lewis, Washington. The Green Berets. Her breath caught. This wasn't just any veteran. This was something else entirely. She scrolled frantically, looking for a contact number. Any connection. She found a general number for Fort Lewis Public Affairs. It was a wild gamble, probably pointless. But she had to try. A bored-sounding specialist answered on the 3rd ring. Fort Lewis Public Affairs. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a public defender in Northwood County." The words tumbled out fast. "I have a client here, a veteran. He's in trouble. The judge doesn't believe his medals are real. Ma'am, we can't get involved in civilian legal matters." The specialist's voice was flat, practiced disinterest. "I know, I understand, but—" Sarah's voice cracked. "His name is James Harrison. He's wearing a 1st group pin. Please. The judge is threatening him with contempt. Psychiatric evaluation. He's 82 years old and the judge is—" "Spell the last name for me." The bored tone was gone, replaced by something sharp. Alert. Harrison. First name James. She heard the sound of rapid typing, then a sharp intake of breath. The voice that came back was completely different. Crisp, urgent, almost reverent. "Ma'am, what courtroom are you in?" "Courtroom C, Northwood County Courthouse. Do not let your client leave. Do not let them take him anywhere. We are on our way." The line went dead. Sarah stood frozen in the alcove, phone still pressed to her ear. The specialist's final words echoed in the sudden silence. "We are on our way." She didn't know what it meant, but something in the man's voice had sent chills down her spine. Hope surged through her, fierce and bright. Back in the courtroom, Mike Patterson had moved from the back row to a seat closer to the front. He couldn't take his eyes off James Harrison. He'd served, sure, but nothing like what those ribbons represented. Bronze Star with V device, 3 of them, Silver Star, 2 awards, and that medal on the blue ribbon. Mike had only seen one of those in person once, at a military ceremony. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor. He leaned toward the woman sitting next to him, an elderly lady waiting for a parking ticket hearing. "That man," Mike whispered, pointing subtly toward James. "Those aren't fake. I served. I know what I'm looking at." The woman squinted through her glasses. "Well, the judge seems to think—" "The judge is wrong," Mike said flatly. "Dead wrong." Judge Brennan was enjoying himself. He'd moved on from the medals to questioning James's mental fitness. "Given your age and your apparent confusion about reality versus fantasy, I'm ordering a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. 72 hours. The bailiff will remand you to county custody for transport to the state hospital." It was the ultimate humiliation. Not just calling the medals fake, not just contempt charges, but declaring James Harrison mentally unfit. Crazy. Delusional. Tom Vasquez, the bailiff, felt sick to his stomach. He looked at the old man standing perfectly still, absorbing this abuse with that same eerie calm. Tom had handcuffed a lot of people in his career. Drunks, domestic abusers, people who'd actually done something wrong. But this? Cuffing an 82-year-old veteran for wearing his service medals? Every instinct he had screamed that this was wrong. The judge raised his gavel. "Mr. "Harrison, you leave me no choice. You are hereby—" A commotion from the hallway interrupted him. Muffled voices, the sound of boots, multiple pairs, moving fast. Judge Brennan froze, gavel still raised. Everyone turned toward the heavy oak doors. They burst open with such force they slammed against the walls. Two soldiers in immaculate army dress blues entered, moving with synchronized precision. They took positions on either side of the entrance, standing at perfect parade rest. Their faces were impassive, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Judge Brennan's mouth hung open, his gavel still suspended in midair. Then a third man entered. 3,000 miles away in Washington state, the phone call had landed like a bomb. The specialist who took Sarah's call didn't hesitate. He bypassed his entire chain of command, connecting directly to the office of Colonel James Reeves, the base commander. The colonel listened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone. The moment he heard the name James Harrison, he stood so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "Hold the line," he commanded. Without knocking, he strode down the hall to a larger, more imposing office suite. Inside, General Marcus Thorne was reviewing supply requisitions. He was a man carved from granite and steel, with 3 silver stars on his shoulders and a gaze that could stop tanks. He looked up, annoyed at the intrusion. "Sir," Colonel Reeves said, his voice tight, "we have a Code Nightingale." The general's eyes sharpened. Code Nightingale wasn't in any manual. It wasn't official. It was an unwritten protocol reserved for a handful of living legends. Men whose service was so extraordinary that the institution itself was honor-bound to protect them, no matter the circumstance. It hadn't been activated in over a decade. "Who?" The general's voice was a low rumble. "Sergeant Major James Harrison, sir." General Thorne was out of his chair before the colonel finished the sentence. A look of disbelief, followed by thunderous rage, passed over his face. "Where is he?" "Northwood County Courthouse, sir. Local judge is holding him in contempt, accusing him of faking his medals. Specifically," the colonel's voice filled with barely contained fury, "the Medal of Honor." The general's jaw clenched until a muscle bunched in his cheek. He moved with a speed and purpose that belied his 58 years. "Get me a helicopter to the nearest airfield. Full honor guard escort. Dress uniforms. I want to be there in under an hour." He turned to his aide. "Get me everything on Judge Brennan of Northwood County. Everything. And get the Secretary of the Army on the line. Tell him a national treasure is being publicly humiliated by a man who doesn't deserve to shine his boots." 37 minutes later, a Black Hawk helicopter touched down at Northwood Regional Airport. A convoy of 2 black SUVs with military plates was waiting. General Thorne, flanked by 2 honor guard soldiers, moved with the controlled urgency of a man on a mission. In the courthouse, Sarah had returned to the defense table, her face pale but her eyes bright with something new. Hope. Determination. She'd made the call. She'd done something. Now all she could do was wait and pray it mattered. Judge Brennan was mid-sentence, enjoying his final crushing statement before bringing down the gavel, when the doors burst open. The general entered, and the entire temperature of the room shifted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform covered in ribbons and decorations. 3 silver stars gleamed on each shoulder. He didn't look at the judge, didn't acknowledge the gallery. His sharp eyes scanned the room until they found their target, James Harrison, standing alone at the defense table, straight-backed despite his age, gray eyes steady. General Marcus Thorne began walking down the center aisle. His polished boots clicked on the tile floor with measured, deliberate steps. Each footfall was like a countdown. Each step shifted the balance of power in the room. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an authority that made Judge Brennan's petty courthouse tyranny look like a child's tantrum. He stopped directly in front of James Harrison, less than 2 feet away. For a long moment, the 2 men simply looked at each other. A universe of shared understanding passed between them in that silent exchange. The general's hard face softened with profound respect. Then General Marcus Thorne snapped to the sharpest, most precise position of attention of his entire career. His right hand came up in a salute so crisp, so perfect, it seemed to cut the very air. His gloved fingers touched the brim of his hat, his arm a rigid line of respect. "Sergeant Major Harrison." The general's voice boomed, filling every corner of the silent room. "It is an honor to be in your presence, sir." He held the salute, his eyes locked on James's. Slowly, as if waking from a long dream, James Harrison straightened even further. The weariness that had settled on him like a cloak seemed to fall away, replaced by an echo of the soldier he'd once been. His weathered hand came up, the movement stiff with age, but no less precise, and returned the salute. Judge Brennan finally found his voice, sputtering with confusion and indignation. "What is the meaning of this? Who are you? I am in the middle of a judicial proceeding." General Thorne slowly lowered his hand. Only after James had lowered his own did the general turn his head. He fixed Judge Brennan with a gaze so cold, so filled with barely restrained fury, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "The meaning, Your Honor," the general said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is that you are in the presence of a hero of the Republic, and you are about to learn a very important lesson about respect." He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a folded document. With deliberate slowness, he unfolded it. His eyes never left the judge as he began to read. Sergeant Major James Robert Harrison. Enlisted, United States Army, 1960. Served with distinction for 28 years. 3 tours in Vietnam. Member of the 5th Special Forces Group. Assigned to Military Assistance Command Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. The general paused, letting the weight of that legendary unit's name settle over the room. SOG. The most classified, dangerous operations of the war. Men who went places that officially didn't exist and did things that were never recorded. Awards and decorations include... The general's voice gained strength with each word. The Bronze Star with V device for valor. 3 awards. The Silver Star for gallantry in action. 2 awards. The Distinguished Service Cross. The Purple Heart. 4 awards. With each medal named, a new wave of shock rippled through the gallery. People sat up straighter. Mike Patterson felt tears sting his eyes. He'd been right. Sarah Chen gripped the edge of the defense table, her own eyes glistening. "And this one," the general said, his voice dropping as he looked directly at the star-shaped medal hanging from the pale blue ribbon. "This piece of tin you so casually dismissed as costume jewelry. This is the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. Awarded to then Staff Sergeant Harrison for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty." The courtroom was so silent you could hear people breathing. On February 4th, 1968, near Hugh City, Sergeant Harrison's reconnaissance team came under intense enemy fire from fortified positions. Despite being wounded and with complete disregard for his own safety, Sergeant Harrison single-handedly assaulted and neutralized 2 enemy machine gun emplacements, eliminating 17 enemy combatants. He then, while still under fire, carried 3 wounded members of his team across 200 meters of open, fire-swept terrain to an evacuation point. The general's voice grew harder, sharper. After ensuring his men were evacuated, Sergeant Harrison returned to the battle. He held his position for 4 hours against overwhelming enemy forces, allowing friendly units to withdraw. Only when ammunition was completely exhausted and reinforcements arrived did he accept medical evacuation. General Thorne folded the paper with precise, angry movements. He stared at Judge Brennan. "This man's jacket, Your Honor, holds more honor than this entire courthouse. Yourself included. He is not a defendant. He is a national treasure. And you saw fit to publicly humiliate him." Judge Brennan had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. He looked small behind his imposing bench. He opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in his judicial career, he was utterly, completely silenced. The general turned back to James. "Sergeant Major, on behalf of the United States Army and a grateful nation, I apologize for the indignity you were subjected to here today. Then he turned that withering gaze back to the judge. As for you, you seem to have a serious problem with veterans. I would suggest you rectify that immediately. I have already been in contact with your state's governor and the head of your Judicial Conduct Commission. They are very interested in reviewing today's transcript. I imagine your career on the bench is about to come to a rather abrupt end. The finality in his voice was absolute. He hadn't just won the argument. He had dismantled Judge Brennan's entire world in less than 5 minutes. It was James Harrison who broke the heavy silence that followed. He placed a gentle hand on General Thorne's arm. His touch was light but carried weight. "Marcus," James said softly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd commanded respect through actions, not rank. "He's just a man who made a mistake. A bad one. But he didn't know." The general's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. James looked up at Judge Brennan, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something that looked almost like compassion. "The medals aren't the point, son," he said. His voice was rough but gentle. "They're just metal and ribbon. Reminders of men who aren't here anymore, of promises I made." He paused, his gray eyes clear and steady. "Respect isn't something you demand with a gavel. It's something you give freely to the person standing in front of you, whether they're a general or a janitor. That's the only lesson here." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Judge Brennan stared at the old man, really seeing him for the first time. The straight military bearing, the calm dignity that came from a place deeper than ego or pride, the quiet strength of someone who'd faced death and chosen honor. Sarah Chen wiped her eyes, not bothering to hide her tears. This was why she'd gone to law school. Not for moments like the mockery she'd witnessed, but for moments like this. Justice. Real justice. Tom Vasquez, the bailiff, felt something release in his chest. He'd witnessed a lot of things in this courtroom, but he'd just seen something rare. Grace under pressure, true dignity. In the gallery, Mike Patterson was on his feet. Without thinking, he brought his hand up in a salute. He was in civilian clothes, hadn't worn a uniform in 15 years, but it felt right, necessary. 3 other people in the gallery stood and did the same. Veterans, recognizing one of their own, honoring a legend. General Thorne looked at James with something approaching reverence. "Sergeant Major, the offer stands. Anything you need. Ever. The Army doesn't forget its heroes." James shook his head slightly. "I don't need anything, Marcus. I just need to get home. Got a motorcycle that needs new brake pads." The general smiled, the first warmth breaking through his military bearing. "The traffic citation?" "Dismissed," came a small voice from the bench. Judge Brennan looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "All charges dismissed. With the court's apology, Mr. Harrison, you're free to go." James nodded once. He turned to Sarah. "Thank you, miss. You didn't have to make that call, but I'm grateful you did." Sarah couldn't speak. She just nodded, her throat too tight with emotion. As James walked toward the courtroom doors, flanked by the honor guard, every single person in the gallery stood. Some saluted. Some just watched in silent respect. The old man in the faded denim jacket with 3 rows of ribbons and a Medal of Honor on his chest walked out with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout his ordeal. General Thorne paused at the doorway. He turned back to address the courtroom one final time. What happened here today should never happen again. To any veteran, in any courthouse. Remember this. He looked directly at Judge Brennan. The uniform may come off, but the honor never does. The doors closed behind them. Judge Brennan sat alone on his bench, his gavel lying forgotten on the polished wood. The weight of what he'd done, what he'd almost done, settled on him like stones. In the silence of his courtroom, he looked at the American flag hanging behind his chair and felt, perhaps for the first time in years, a profound and terrible shame. The news of what happened in Courtroom C spread like wildfire. The story, broken by a local reporter who'd been waiting for a permit hearing, was picked up by regional news within hours and national outlets by evening. The image of General Thorne saluting the quiet old veteran became viral, a symbol of honor and accountability. Judge Richard Brennan was suspended pending investigation. After a formal review by the State Judicial Conduct Commission, he was forced into early retirement. He never wore the robes again. In response to the public outcry, the state legislature passed new legislation, unofficially called Harrison's Law. It mandated comprehensive training for all public officials regarding military service, veteran affairs, and cultural sensitivity. It also created an oversight committee to review complaints of veteran mistreatment in legal proceedings. General Thorne personally ensured that James Harrison's traffic citation was not just dismissed, but expunged from all records with a formal written apology from the state. James Harrison wanted none of the attention. He declined interview requests from major networks. He turned down invitations to speak at military events. He simply went back to his quiet life in Northwood, working on his motorcycle in his garage, meeting his friends for coffee on Tuesday mornings at the local diner. About 6 weeks after the courthouse incident, James was sitting in his usual booth when the door chimed. A man walked in, older, thinner, wearing a simple polo shirt and khaki pants. He looked hesitant, out of place. It was Richard Brennan, former judge. He saw James and walked slowly to the booth. "Mr. Harrison," Brennan said quietly. "May I sit?" James gestured to the seat across from him, said nothing, just waited. "I wanted to apologize," Brennan began, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I did, what I said. There's no excuse. I was arrogant, cruel, wrong." He finally looked James in the eye. "I'm sorry." James took a slow sip of his coffee. He studied the man across from him, saw someone broken by his own pride, someone learning a hard lesson. "The coffee here's pretty good," James said finally. He pushed a menu across the table. "You should try it." It was an offer of peace, simple, graceful, an act of forgiveness that cost nothing and meant everything. Brennan looked up, something releasing in his expression. He nodded. "Thank you. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields. They're won in small-town diners over cups of coffee, in the quiet choice to extend grace instead of holding grudges, in remembering that everyone deserves respect, whether they wear stars on their shoulders or khakis from a department store." James Harrison understood that. He'd always understood that. It's why he wore the medals, not as decoration, but as reminders of the men who never came home, of the promises he'd made to honor their sacrifice, of the simple truth that real strength isn't about demanding respect. It's about giving it freely, even to those who don't deserve it. To everyone who typed honor and shared where you're watching from, thank you for standing with our heroes. Subscribe for more stories like this and unsung American heroes. See you in the next one.